Proximity sense signalled left. Carl rose and twisted at mesh speed, still blinking the blood from his eyes. Machete Boy ran onto the shark punch, screaming abomination and hellfire. This time Carl pulled the trigger in sheer reflex. The impact kicked the boy back toward the open door and tore him apart in mid-air. The screaming died in mid-syllable, the wall and doorway suddenly painted with gore. Carl gaped at the damage the weapon had done. And Merrin hit him from the side. Locked out the gun in exactly the same way Carl had taken it from its original owner. Carl grunted and let the other 13's attack carry the two of them around in a stumbling dance. Kept the gaping muzzle of the shark punch angled hard away as best he could. He tried for a Tanindo throw, but Merrin knew the move. They lurched again, feet on the edge of the opening in the shed floor, where the slipway ran in.
"Been looking for you,"
Carl gritted. Merrin's fingers dug into his wrist. Carl heaved and let the shark punch go, through the hole in the floor. It hit the slope below and clattered heavily away downward. Better than leaving it lying around for Wren to pick up and use. He tried another technique to get loose, working his feet back from the hole and hitching an elbow strike at Merrin's belly. The other 13 smothered the blow, hooked out Carl's ankle with a heel, and brought both of them down. He got in an elbow of his own, blunt force into the side of Carl's face. Vision flew apart. Merrin got on top, grinned down at the black man like a wolf.
"I did not cross the void to be killed like a cudlip," he hissed. "To die like meat on the slab. You have not understood who I am."
He drove a forearm up into Carl's throat, bore down and began to crush his larynx. Carl, vision still starry, took the only option left, levered with one leg, rolled, and tipped them both over the edge. It wasn't a long drop, the height of the haulage cradle when it slotted into place at the top of the ramp, 3 meters at most, but the impact broke their holds on each other and they rolled down the slope apart. 20 meters farther down, the solid steel bulk of the locked-up cradle waited to greet them. Impact was going to hurt. Carl got himself feet first in the tumble and tried to jam a foot into the crank cable channel. The sole of his boot skidded off the nanofiber, braked him, but not a lot. Merrin came ploughing past at his shoulder, grabbed at him and tugged him loose again. He kicked out, missed, slithered after the other 13. The cradle loomed, smooth curve of the sub's hull held in its massive, forked iron grasp. Merrin hit, shrugged it off at mesh speed, braced himself upright against one of the forks. He turned to face Carl with a snarling grin. Carl panicked, jammed his foot hard into the cable space again, tried to sit as his knee bent. He must have hit a bracket or a support brace. His fall locked to a halt a couple of meters off impact with the cradle. The momentum flipped him almost upright, hurled him down to meet Merrin like a bad skater fighting to stay upright. The other 13 gaped. Carl was coming in impossibly high. Carl snapped out a fist, some reflex he didn't know he owned, and drove into the side of Merrin's neck with all the force of his arrival. It nearly broke his wrist. He felt the abused joint creak with the impact, but it was lost in the surge of savage joy as Merrin choked and sagged. He pivoted off the punch and cannoned into the side of the sub. Merrin made some kind of blocking move, but it was weak. Carl beat it down, seized the other 13's head in both hands, and smashed it sideways as hard as he could against the edge of the cradle fork. Merrin made a strangled, raging noise and lashed out. Carl shrugged off the blow, smashed the 13's head into the metal again, and again, and again. Felt the fight go finally out of the other man. Didn't stop. Didn't stop until blood made a sudden blotched spray across the grey hull of the sub and sprinkled warm on his face again. Chapter 39. Sevgi came down the gantry stairs through a flood of CSI lighting and experts setting up their gear. Rimsec had cordoned off the whole of starboard loading, shepherded everyone out for questioning, and then locked the place down. There were uniforms along the upper walkways at every entry point, and a sharkish black patrol boat prowled the ocean alongside the open bay. Smaller inflatables fringed the water's edge at the bottom of the slipway like orange seaweed, wagging back and forth with the slop of the waves against the slope. There was a sense of hollowness under the vaulted roof, of something emptied out and done. Sevgi fished her Colin identification from a pocket and showed it to a supervising officer at the Daskin Azul docking shed. Surprised herself with a faint stab of nostalgia for the days of her palm-wired NYPD hollow badge. Being a cop. Back in the day. The officer looked back at her blankly. "Yeah, what do you want?" "I'm looking for Carl Marsalis. I was told he's still down here." "Marsalis?" The woman stayed mystified for a moment, then the light dawned. "Oh, you're talking about the Twist, the guy that did all this damage." Sevgi was too churned up to call the rim cop on her terminology. She nodded. The officer pointed down the slope. "He's sitting down there on that empty cradle, one across from this slip. Was going to have him forcibly removed for questioning, but then some special cases badge calls down and says to leave him be, the guy can sit there all night if he wants." She made a weary gesture. "Who am I to argue with special cases, right?" Sevgi murmured something sympathetic and headed on down the stairs beside the Daskin Azul slipway. When she got level with the empty cradle on the other slip, she had to pick her way awkwardly across the sloping surface, once or twice teetering and dropping to a crouch to stop herself from falling. She reached the cradle and hung on to one of the forks with relief. "Hey there," she said awkwardly. Marsalis glanced down, apparently surprised to see her. It was the first time she'd seen him so unaware of his surroundings, and it jolted her more than the surprise had shaken him. She wondered briefly if he was in shock. His clothes were covered with drying blood in big, uneven patches, and there were smeared specks and streaks still on his face where he'd washed, but apparently hadn't scrubbed hard enough. "You okay?" she asked. He shrugged. "Few bruises. Nothing serious. When did you get here?" "A while ago. Been upstairs shouting at Daskin Azul's management." Sevgi hauled herself up onto the cradle, propped herself against the fork next to him, and slid her legs out in front of her. "So, turns out you called it right after all." "Yeah. 13 paranoia. Don't gloat, Marsalis. It's not attractive." "Well, I'm not looking to get laid." She shot him a sideways glance. "No, I guess you've probably had enough of that for one night." He shrugged again, didn't look at her. "Daskin Azul are denying any knowledge," she said. "As far as they're concerned, Merrin, Wren, and Osborne were all casual employees, automatically renewed contracts every month unless there's a problem, and there never was. They're lying in their teeth, but I don't know if Rimsek are going to be able to prove that." "Osborne?" "The guy who jumped you with a machete. Scott Osborne. Jesus Land fence hopper. Rimsek Forensics reckon he was one of the Ward Biosupply employees who ran when Merrin showed up there. DNA match with genetic trace leavings from here and Ward's place." He nodded. "And Wren?" "That's a tougher one. There was no genetic trace for her at Ward's place, so it looks like she or someone else went over there and cleaned up after they left. But we're working off witness description composites, and yeah, looks like she was there too." "What about gene trace here? Have they run that?" "Not yet." She looked at him again curiously. "You don't seem very happy about any of this." "I'm not." She frowned. "Marsalis, it's over. You get to go home now. You know, back to London and your smug European social comfort zone." He raised an eyebrow, stared out at the water. "Lucky me." Abruptly, there was a light, tripping pulse in her throat. She tried for irony. "What? Are you going to miss me?" He turned to look at her now. "This isn't over, Sevgi." "It isn't?" She felt a little crime scene macabre creep into her tone. "Well, you could have fooled me. I mean, you did just kill them all. Osborne and the other guy are all over the walls and floor up there. Merrin, you just brained. I'd say we're pretty much done, wouldn't you?" "And Wren?" Sevgi gestured. Throwaway. "Pick her up, sooner or later." "Yeah? Like you did after she split from Ward Biosupply?" "Marsalis, you're fucking up the victory parade here. Wren's aftermath. She's a detail at most. Merrin's dead. That's what counts." "Yeah. Suppose we should be celebrating, right? That's right, we should. He nodded and reached into his inmate jacket, produced a well-made blunt and held it up for her approval. Want some? What is it? Don't know. Someone gave it to me, in case I needed to celebrate. He put the blunt in his mouth and crunched the ember end to life, drew in smoke, coughed a little. Here, try. Not bad. She took it and drew her own toke. The smoke went down sweet and silty, enhanced dope and an edge of something else on it. She held it in, let it go. Felt the cool languor of the hit come stealing along her limbs. All sorts of knots seemed to loosen in her head. She drew again, let it up, quicker this time, and handed the blunt back to him. So tell me why you're not happy, she said. Because I don't like being played, and this whole fucking thing was a set-up from the start. He smoked in gloomy quiet for a while, then held the blunt up and examined the burning end. Fucking monster myths. Eh? Monsters, he said bitterly. Super-terrorists, serial killers, criminal masterminds. It's always the same fucking lie. Might as well be talking about werewolves and vampires for all the difference it makes. We are the good, the civilized people, huddled here in our cosy ring of firelight, our cities and our homes, and out there, a wide gesture, warming to his theme now, out in the dark, the monster prowls. The big evil, the threat to the tribe. Kill the beast and all will be well. Never mind them. You going to smoke that or not? He blinked. Yeah, sorry. Here. So you don't think we've killed the beast? Sure, we've killed it. So what? That doesn't give us any answers. We still don't know why Merrin came back from Mars or what the point of all these deaths was. Should have asked him. Yeah, well, slipped my mind at the time, you know. She stared at the toes of her boots, frowned. Look, maybe you're right. Maybe we don't have the answers yet. But the fact we don't know what this was about doesn't mean we shouldn't be happy we've stopped it. We didn't stop it. I already told you. This whole thing was set up. Oh, come on. Set up how? Ravayo says you took Dusky and Azul totally by surprise. They weren't expecting this to happen. We were early. What? He took the blunt from her. We were early. They didn't expect me to push so hard. They were maybe going to let this play out sometime next week. Let what play out next week? Exasperation slightly blurred by whatever they were smoking. You think Merrin planned to let you kill him? I don't know, he said thoughtfully. He certainly didn't fight as hard as I expected him to. I mean, I got lucky in the end, but the whole thing felt, I don't know, slack. Anyway, that's not the main point. Wren could have come in at any point and tipped the balance. She wasn't injured. All I did was knock her on her back. So, she just cut her losses, got out while she could. After partnering this guy for the last 4 months? I don't think so. Wren was a pro. It was stamped right through her. The way she moved, the way she stood, the way she looked at you. Someone like that doesn't panic, doesn't mistake one unarmed man for a rimsec invasion. Did you tell her you were 13? He gave her a tired look. Well, did you? Yeah, I did, but... There you are, then. She bent one knee, eased around to face him more. That's what panicked her. Look, Marsalis, I've been around you when the fighting starts, and it scares me. And I know what a 13 really is. So did she. She'd been caretaking one for the last 4 months, remember? That's not the same as facing one in combat. She'd have a standard human response to that, a standard... Not this woman. Oh, you think you're an expert on women, do you? I'm an expert on soldiers, Sevgi, and that's what Wren was. She was someone's soldier, the same someone who hired Merrin out of Mars. And whoever that someone was, for whatever reasons, they were getting ready to sell him out. Maybe because he'd served his purpose. Maybe because we were getting too close to the truth down in Cusco. Either way, this, he nodded back toward the CSI bars on the slope above them, All this was a planned outcome. Colin with its boot on the corpse of the beast, big smiles for the camera, congratulations all around. Fade out to a happy ending. Doesn't sound so bad to me, she muttered. Really? He plumed smoke up at the nanofiber vault. And there I was thinking you were a cop. Ex-cop. You're confusing me with Rovio. You really ought to try and keep the women you fuck separate in your head. She took the blunt from him brusquely. He watched her smoke for a couple of moments in silence. She pretended not to notice. Sevgi, he said finally, you can't tell me you're happy to walk away, knowing we've been played. Can't I? She met his eyes, exploded a lungful of smoke at him. You're wrong, Marsalis. I can walk away from this happy, because the fucked-up psycho who cut Helena Larson into pieces and ate her is dead. I guess for that, at least, I should thank you. Don't mention it. Yeah. And maybe we don't know why Merrin came back, and maybe we'll never know. But I can live with that, just like I lived with more unsolved cases than you'll ever know when I worked homicide. You don't always get a clean rap. Life is messy, and so is crime. Sometimes you just gotta be happy you got the bad guy and call time on the rest. He turned away to look at the sea. Well, that must be a human thing. Yeah, must be. Norton'll be pleased. She rolled her head sideways, blue smoke, nailed him through it with another look. We're not going to talk about Tom Norton. Fine. We're not going to talk about Norton. We're not going to talk about Wren. We're not going to talk about anything inconvenient because you've got your monster and that's all that matters. Christ, no wonder you people are in such a mess. Anger ignited behind her eyes. Us people? Fuck you, Marsalis. You know what? Us people are running a more peaceful planet now than the human race has ever fucking seen. There's prosperity, tolerance, justice. Not in Florida, that I noticed. Okay, what do you want? That's Jesus land. Globally, things are getting better. There's no fighting in the Middle East. For the time being. No starving in Africa. No war with China. Only because no one has the guts to take them on. No, because we have learned that taking them on is a losing game. No one wins a war anymore. Change is slow. It has to come from within. Tell that to the Black Lab refugees. Oh, spare me the fucking pseudo-empathy. You could give a shit about some Chinese escapee you never met. I know you, Marsalis. Injustice is personal for guys like you. If it didn't happen to you or someone you think belongs to you, then it doesn't touch you at all. You don't... It did fucking happen to me! The shout ripped loose, floated away in the immensity of the vaulted space. She wondered if the Rimsec CSI crew heard it. His hands were on her shoulders, fingers hooked into her flesh, head jutting close, eyes locked into hers. They hadn't been this close since they fucked, and something deeply buried, some ancestor subroutine in her genes picked up on the proximity and sent the old, confused signals pulsing out. It was the part of herself she most hated. She kept the locked stare, reached up and jabbed the lit ember of the blunt into the back of his hand. Something detonated in his eyes, inked out just as fast. He unhinged his fingers with a snap, backed off a fraction at a time. She drove him back with her eyes. "Keep your fucking hands off me," she hissed. "You think—" His voice was hoarse. He stopped, swallowed, and started again. "You think I can't empathize with someone out of the Black Labs, some gene experiment made flesh? I am them, Sevgi. I mean, what do you think Osprey was? I am a fucking experiment. I grew up in a controlled environment, managed and checklisted by men in fucking suits. I lost—" He stopped again. This time his eyes slid away from hers. A faint frown furrowed his brow. For a split second she thought he was going to weep, and something prickled at the base of her own throat in sympathy. "Motherfucker," he said softly. She waited. Finally she had to prompt him. "What?" Marsalis looked at her, and his eyes were washed clean of the rage. His voice stayed low. Bumbaran, he said. Monko fucking Bumbaran. What about him? He was fucking with me, back at Sacsayhuaman. He thought they took Marisol, my surrogate, away from me when I was 14. But that's lawman. In Osprey they did it at 11. Different psych theory. So? So he was too close to the detail. It wasn't just the age, it was the other stuff. He was talking about men in uniforms, debriefing in a steel trailer fab. Osprey's handlers all wore suits, and we never had any trailers. The whole place was purpose-built and permanent. She shrugged. Maybe he's read about it, seen footage. That's not how it sounded, Sevgi. It sounded personal, as if he'd been involved. He sighed. I know. 13 paranoia, right? She hesitated. It's pretty thin. Yeah. He looked away from her, seemed to make an effort. She saw his mouth clamp. He met her eyes again. I'm sorry I grabbed you like that. Thought I had that shit locked down. It's okay. Just don't do it again. Ever. He took the blunt from her very gently. It was down to the stub and smouldering unequally from where she'd stabbed his hand with it. He coaxed a little more from it, drew deep. So, what's going to happen now? He asked, voice tight with holding down the smoke. She grimaced. Aftermath, like I said. We're going to be chasing the detail for months, but they'll start to fold the case priority away. Someone somewhere is going to figure out how to knock off some major unlicensed Mars tech again, and we'll get switched to that. File Merrin for a rainy day. Yeah. What I thought. Look, let it go, Carl. Impulsively, she reached out and took his hand. The same hand she'd scorched. Just let go and walk away. You're home free. We'll look at the Familia thing. Who knows, maybe we'll get somewhere with it. You go down there without me, all you'll get is killed. But he was smiling as he said it. You saw what happened last time. She flickered the smile back at him. Well, maybe we'll be a bit less full-frontal in our approach. He grunted, held up the dying blunt, querying. She shook her head, and he just held it there between them for a moment or two. Then he shrugged, took one last toke, and pitched it out through the cradle forks, down the long slope to the water. You chase that aftermath, he said. We will. But out beyond the vault of starboard loading, the waves were starting to pale, black to gunmetal, as the early light of a whole new day crept in. Chapter 40. Back at the hotel, he opaqued the windows against the unwelcome dawn. Jet lag and fight ache stalked him through the darkened suite to the bed. He shed his clothes on the floor and stood staring down at them. Sigma Stigma, the back of the inmate jacket, reminded him in cheery orange. Sevgi Atakin stood in his thoughts and waved. She'd walked him up to the helipad on Bulgakov's cat and seen him off. Was still standing there with one arm raised as the cat dropped away below and behind the autocopter, visible detail blurring out. He grimaced, tried to shake the memory off. He ripped the bed open irritably, crawled in and tugged a sheet across his shoulder. Sleep came and buried him. The phone. He rolled awake in the still darkened room, convinced he'd only just closed his eyes. Steady blue glow digits at the bedside disputed the impression. 17:09. He'd slept through the day. He held up his wrist, peering stupidly at the watch he'd forgotten to take off, as if a hotel clock could somehow be wrong. The wrist ached from the fumbled blow he'd hit Merrin with. He turned it a little, flexing. Might even be... Phone, answer the fucking... He groped for it, hooked the audio receiver up to his ear. Yeah? What? Marsalis? A voice he should know, but sleep scrambled didn't. Is that you? Who the fuck is this? Ah, so it is you. The name came just ahead of his own belated recognition of the measured tones. Gianfranco de Palma here. Brussels office. Carl sat up in bed, frowning. What do you want? I have just been speaking to an agent Nicholson in New York. De Palma's perfect, barely accented UN English floated urbanely down the line. I understand that Colin have no further use for your services, and that they have arranged that all charges against you in the Republic will be dropped forthwith. It seems you will be returning to Europe very shortly. Yeah, news to me. Well, I don't think we need to wait around on formalities. I'll have an Angler shuttle dispatched to SFO tonight. If you would care to be at the suborbital terminal around midnight. No, I wouldn't. I am sorry? South Florida State swirled up into his mind like dirty water backing up from a blocked drain. A sudden decision gripped him, cheery as the lettering on his Sigma Stigma jacket. I said you can fuck off, De Palma. Write it down. Fuck right off. You let me sit in a Jesus-land jail for 4 months, and I'd still be there for all the fucking efforts you made to get me out. And you still owe me expenses from fucking January. And just like that, out of nowhere, he was furious, trembling with a sudden rage. So don't think for one fucking moment I'm going to jump into line just because you finally got your dick out of your own arse. I am not done here. I am very far from done here, and I'll come home when I'm fucking good and ready. There was a stiff pause at the other end of the line. You understand, I assume, said De Palma silkily, that you are not authorized to operate without Angler jurisdiction. Of course, your time is your own to dispose of, but we cannot agree to you having any further professional contact with Colin or the Rim States Security Corps. In the interests of— What's the matter with you, De Palma? Don't you have a pen there? I told you to fuck off. Want me to spell it? I strongly advise you not to take this attitude. Yeah? Well, I strongly advise you to go and get a caustic soda enema. Let's see which of us takes direction best, shall we? He broke the connection, sat staring at the phone for a while. So, planning to pay for our own suborb ticket, are we? And look for a new job when we get back? It won't come to that. They need me worse than De Palma's dented pride. They don't need you worse than a breach of the Accords, which is what it's going to be if you pick up that phone again and call Sevgi Ertekin. You heard the man. Any further professional contact. The phone sat in his hand. Just go home, Carl. You gave them their monster. Got another notch on your belt, right up there next to Grey. 13 liquidator top of your game. Just take that and ride it home, maybe even bluff it into a raise when you get back. The phone. Come on. Leave her alone. You're not doing her any favours pushing this. Let her walk away like she wants to. Maybe she doesn't really want to walk away. Oh, how very alpha male of you. What's next? Form an angry young tribute band? People got to lead their own lives, Carl. He tightened his fingers on the smooth plastic of the receiver, touched it to his head. His whole body ached, he realized suddenly. A dozen different, small, jabbing reminders of the fight with Merrin. Merrin's done, Carl. All over. There's still Norton. Lying fuck tried to have you killed in New York, maybe down in Peru as well. You don't know that. He's right next to her still. She starts asking awkward questions. He could have her hit the same way he tried with you. You don't know he did that, and anyway he's a little too dewy-eyed around Sevgi Ertekin to let anything like that happen to her, and you know it. He grunted, lowered the phone, and stared at it again. Give it up, Carl. You're just looking for excuses to get back inside something you never wanted to be a part of in the first place. Just cut it loose and go home. He grimaced, dialed from memory. Sevgi took the call on her way through a seemingly endless consumer space. Late afternoon crowds clogged the malls and the open-access stores, crippled her pace to limping. She had to keep slowing and darting sideways to get past stalled-out families or knots of dawdling, finery-decked youth. She had to queue on escalators as they cranked their slow, ease-of-gawking trajectories up and down in the dizzying cathedral spaces of racked product. She had to shoulder through gathered accretions of bargain hunters under hollow signs that screamed, "Reduced, reduced, reduced to this!" It had been the same fucking thing all day, everywhere she went in the upper levels of Bulgakov's cat. The temptation to produce badge and gun to clear passage was a palpable itch in the pit of her stomach. "Yeah, Erdekin?" "Alcatraz Control here. I have a patched call for you. Will you take it?" "Patched?" She frowned. "Patched from where?" "New York, apparently. A Detective Williamson." She grappled with memory. Saw again the tall, hard-boned black man amid uniforms and incident barriers and the shrink-wrapped corpses outside her home. Marsalis, seated on the front steps, gazing at it all like a tourist, as if the dead men were nothing to do with him at all. Crisp October air, and the never-stilled sounds of the city getting on with life. New York seemed suddenly as far away as Mars, and the gun battle some part of her distant past. "Yeah, I'll take it." Williamson came through, wavery with a patch. "Ms. Erdekin?" "Speaking." A little breathless from her pace through a bookstore with mercifully few browsing customers.
"Is this a bad time?"
"No worse than any other. What can I do for you, Detective?"
"It's more what I can do for you, Ms. Erdekin. We have some information you might like."
He hesitated for a moment.
"I ran into Larry Kasabian. He speaks very highly of you."
She blinked back to the mist-deadened sounds of the IA digging robot, the field at dawn, and the sudden waft of the bodies. Kasabian at her side, blunt and silent, an occasional flickered glance under knotted brows. Once he nodded grimly at her, some barely perceptible amalgam of solidarity and weariness, but he never spoke. It was the habit of weeks now. They were all watching their words. IA were all over the place, authorized to listen electronically who knew where. "That's very kind of Larry." She fended off a bovine gaggle of shoppers grazing amid menswear, hopped half to a halt, and dodged around them. "And kind of you to call me. So what have you got?"
"What I've got, Ms. Erdekin, is your third shooter for Alvaro Ortiz."
She nearly stopped again, in clear space.
"Is he alive?" "Very much so. There's a hole in his shoulder, but otherwise he'll be just fine. Got into a fight in a bar over in Brooklyn, pulled a piece, and it turns out the place is full of off-duty cops."
Williamson chuckled.
"You believe that luck?"
"Not a local boy, then?"
"No, he's from the Republic, someplace out west. Dirk Schindel. Right of residence in the Union. He's got a grandparent up in Maine somewhere, but no official citizenship. We can't put him at the scene with genetic trace, but he's copped to it anyway."
"How do you manage that?"
"We're sweating him pretty hard," Williamson said casually. "Got one of the homicide psych teams on it. Thing is, our boy Dirk was all fucked up on hormone jolts and street sin when the Brooklyn thing went down. You know what a cocktail like that'll do. He's babbling like a snake handler."
Along her nerves, Sevgi felt the subtle thrum of her own decidedly non-street sin dosage. She summoned a dutiful chuckle. "Yeah, seen that before. So what's he said about Ortiz?"
"Said a whole lot of stuff. I can file it over to you if you want. Boils down to he was hired out of Houston by some front guy he's never met, friend of the other two in the crew. Quite a lot of money, which I guess for a hit on a guy like Ortiz you'd expect, but it doesn't explain why the low-grade hires. Schindel says he's whacked guys before in the Republic, but the psych team think he's lying. At best they reckon he was maybe a driver or a backup man."
"What about the others?"
"Yeah, Leroy Atkins. That's the guy your enhanced friend put down with the machine pistol. Turns out he's got some record in the Republic, but strictly spray-and-run stuff. Cop I talked to in the Houston PD said he thought Atkins might have upped his game in the last couple of years, gone out of state for the work. Nothing they can touch him for. It's just street rumor and implied Yaroshenko links from some West Coast engine Houston rent time on. Same with the other guy, Fabiano. Angel Fabiano. Houston resident, some gang affiliations down there. Been doing time since he was a kid, but they never got him for worse than possession of abortifacients with intent to sell, and some aggravated assault. But Houston reckoned he might have upgraded as well. He's a known associate of Atkins.
Okay. Disloyalty for Norton snaked in her, deep enough to force a grimace onto her face. She asked anyway. Did Schindel have anything to say about Marsalis?
Marsalis? The 13 guy?
Pause while Williamson presumably scrolled through the report.
No, nothing here outside of we would have brought the whole thing off too. That fucking nigger Twist hadn't been there. No offense.
No offense?
Yeah.
Williamson's tone shifted into sour amusement.
One of the psych teams the same color as me. This is one sensitive Jesus-lander we're dealing with here.
Sevgi grunted. Probably the sin talking. He tell you how they ended up outside my front door?
Yeah, he was pissed about that too. Told us they'd been watching Ortiz for weeks, mapping his moves. Seems he always went by this coffee house he liked on West 97th. They were going to track him across there on the skates and light him up outside. The skates, that's an old Houston Sicario standby apparently. Good for city center hits where you've got high-volume, slow-moving traffic. Anyway, the way Schindel paints it, Ortiz breaks his routine and heads uptown suddenly. They go after him, but it nearly kills them to keep up. By the time they get to 118th, they're panting like dogs. They just want to get this thing finished.
Very pro. She could hear the lightness in her own tone. The vindication of Norton blew through her like a cool breeze. She even found a smile for some face-painted idiot who collided with her coming around a support column and then backed off, all apologies and smiles.
Right, Williamson agreed. Not quite Houston's finest, it seems.
No.
Yeah.
The New York detective hesitated again.
So, like I said, I talked to Kasabian. He told me you'd want to know. Was going to hang on to this until you were back in town, but then I caught you on that news flash out of the Rim this morning. So I figure the Rim, that's where Ortiz is from originally. Maybe this ties into whatever you're dealing with out there.
The press conference, hastily called in a deck-level government garden amidships, her dry lack-of-progress report buffered by wooden professions of coordinated effort from RIMSEC and the CAT's security services, a brief, sonorous pronouncement from a local political aide. It all seemed to be sliding into the past at alarming speed as well. She made a fleeting match with the feeling she'd had on the highway out of Cusco, the sense of time slipping through her fingers. Marsalis at her side like a dark rock she could maybe cling to. She grimaced, shouldered the image aside like another drowsy shopper getting in her way.
Well, listen, Detective, I appreciate you taking the trouble to hand me this. See if I can't return the favor someday. No need. Like I said, saw the news flash. A lot of talk about agency cooperation in America these days. A lot of talk. I figure maybe it's time there actually started to be some too.
I hear that. Can you wire the Schindel file across to RIMSEC at Alcatraz? I'll pick it up there later.
Will do. Hope it helps.
The New York patch clicked out, taking Williamson's accent and the winter city with it, left her with a star-static, almost hush of satellite time, and then nothing at all.
Nothing. That's what I'm telling you.
Carl shook his head irritably.
Matthew, I told you this guy just doesn't feel right. Are you sure?
I am better than sure, Carl. I am mathematically accurate. Tom Norton's associational set is as close to perfectly behaved citizenship as it's possible for a human to get. The worst blemish I can find is a data implication that his brother may have helped him get his job at Colin. But you're talking about a good word in the right ear, not outright nepotism. And it's years in the past. No sense of a continuing influence.
You certain about that?
Yes, I am certain. In fact, the data suggests that he and his brother don't get on all that well. Same-sex sibling relationships are often combative, and in this case the Nortons seem to have resolved theirs by living at opposite ends of the continent. Carl stared at the hotel window, where evening was already starting to shut down the sky. His reflection stared back, hemmed him in. He put a crooked elbow to the glass and leaned on it with his forearm over his head, fingers stroking through his hair. It was something Marisol used to.
And the New York hit? The fact he was the only person who knew where I was sleeping?
Is coincidence, said Matthew crisply. He met his reflection's eyes in the glass. Well, it doesn't feel much like it from where I'm standing. Coincidence never does. It's not in the nature of human genetic wiring to accept it. And as a 13, you have your own increased predisposition toward paranoia to contend with as well. Carl grimaced. Has it ever occurred to you, Matt, that... Matthew. Yeah, Matthew. Sorry. Has it ever occurred to you that for a 13, for someone who doesn't connect well with group dynamics, paranoia might be quite a useful trait to have? Yes, and evolutionarily selective too. The Datahawk's didactic tone had not shifted. It almost never did. Didactic was part of the way Matthew was wired. But this is not the point. Human intuition is deceptive because it is not always consistent. It is not necessarily a good fit for the environments we now live in, or the mathematics that underlie them. When it does echo mathematical form, it's clearly indicative of an inherent capacity to detect the underlying mathematics. But not when they clash. Carl leaned his forehead against the glass. They'd had this discussion before, countless times. Right? Not when they clash, Matthew agreed. When they clash, the mathematics remain correct. The intuition merely indicates a mismatch of evolved capacities with a changed or changing environment. So Norton's clean. Norton is clean. Carl turned his back on his reflection, leaned against the window and looked around the room that caged him. He recognized the reflex, seeking exits. Stupid. There was the fucking door right there. So use it, fuckwit. Does it ever bother you? He asked into the phone. Does what bother me, Carl? This whole thing. He gestured as if Matthew could see him. Jacobson, the fucking Accords, the agency and the enforcement, having to be licensed like some fucking hazardous substance. To the extent that personal identification records are a form of social licensing, we are all licensed, base humans and variants alike. If the type of licensing reflects certain gradients of social risk, is that a bad thing? Carl sighed. Okay, forget it. I'm asking the wrong person. In what way? Well, no offence, but you're a gleech. Your whole profile is post-autistic. This is an emotional thing we're talking about. My emotional range has been psychochemically rebalanced and extended. Yeah, by an engine. Sorry, Matthew. I don't know why I'm fronting you with this stuff. You're no more normal than I am. Leaving aside for a moment the question of what exactly you would consider to be a normal human, what makes you think you would receive a more valid answer from one? Are normal humans especially gifted in discovering complex ethical truths? Carl thought about that. Not that I've noticed, he admitted gloomily. No. So my perception of the post-Jacobson order is probably no more or less useful than any other rational humans. Yeah, but that's just the big fat point, Carl grinned. There was a solid pleasure in catching the Datahawk and his hyper-balanced mindset out, mainly because he didn't get to do it very often. This isn't about rational humans. The Jacobson report wasn't about a rational response to genetic licensing. It was about a group of rational men trying to broker a deal with a gibbering mass of irrational humanity. The religious lunatics, the race purists, the whole doom of civilization crew. For a moment he stared off blindly into the corner of the room. I mean, don't you remember all that stuff back in 89, 90? The demonstrations, the vitriol in the feeds, the mobs outside the facilities and the army bases crashing the fences. Yes, I remember it, but it didn't bother me. Carl shrugged. Well, you didn't scare them like we did. And yet, Jacobson was not a capitulation to the forces you describe. The report is critical of both irrational responses and simplistic thinking. Yeah, but look who ended up in the tracts anyway. Matthew said nothing. Carl saw Stefan Navant's lupine grin, rubbed at his eyes to make it go away. Look, Matt, thanks. Matthew. Sorry, Matthew. Thanks for the check on Norton, okay? Talk to you soon. He hung up, tossed the phone on the bed and got rapidly dressed in the least used and blooded garments from among his limited wardrobe. He let himself out of the hotel room, paused briefly on his way past Sevgi Ertekin's door, then made an exasperated noise in his throat and stalked on. He waited 10 impatient seconds at the elevator, then stiff-armed the door to the emergency stairwell open instead and went down the steps 2 at a time, crossed the lobby at a fast stride, and went out into the city. He walked a single block to get the feel of the evening, then flagged down an autocab. The interior was low-lit and cosy, an expansive black leatherette womb with narrow views to the passing street. In the gloom on the front panel, an armoured screen blipped into life and showed him a rather idealised female driver interface. Generic rim beauty. The classic Asian-Hispanic blend. Pinned dark hair, a hint of a curl in it. Chic high-collar jacket. Something of Carmen Wren in the features and the poise, but machined up to an inhuman perfection. The voice was an Asia Badawi rip-off. "Good evening, sir. Welcome to cable cars. What will be your choice of destination this evening?" He hesitated. Sutherland, he knew, would not have been impressed with this. Sutherland's on fucking Mars. "Just take me somewhere I can get in a fight," he said. Switched off and careless from jet lag, long sleep, and yesterday's fight, he never noticed the figure on the corner, but watched him leave the hotel, or the nondescript teardrop that slid out from parking on the opposite side of the street and dropped into the traffic behind his cab. Chapter 41. Dougie Kwang's week had been shaping up for shit ever since it started, and tonight didn't look any better. He was 3 games down to Valdez already, stalking the angles of the table, pumping violent, crack-bang shots to take his mind off it all. The technique, if you want to call it that, he fumed, mostly just rattled the balls in the jaws and they sat out more often than he sank them. He knew his anger was the exact reason he was losing, but he couldn't shake it loose. There was too much else gone to shit around him. Wundawari's shipment never made it through MTC in Jakarta. Wundawari herself was now banged up in an Indonesian jail on trumped-up holding charges until some scummy Seattle-based rights lawyer she used could wire across and get her out. The money was gone. "Write it off," the Seattle guy advised dryly down the line. "What you maybe claw back from the maritime transit guys in compensation, you're going to be paying me in fees." Dougie might have called him on that one, but Wundawari wouldn't do the time, and both he and Seattle knew it. She was too soft, came from Kuala Lumpur money and a whole creche of spoiled brat connections down in Freeport. She'd pay whatever Seattle wanted. On the street, things were no better. Alcatraz Station were coming down hard and heavy all over the fucking place, big-ass rim-sec interventions at levels those guys mostly didn't bother with. He still couldn't find out why. Some shit about a factory raft bust last night and the fallout, but none of his few bought and paid-for touches inside the rim-sec machine ranked high enough to know any more than that. More importantly, they were too fucking scared of Alcatraz to risk sniffing around any closer. End result was he couldn't move shit anywhere north of Selby or west of the boulevard, and even in the yards at Hunter Point he was getting heat he didn't need. And the border had been sticky for fucking months now. None of the gangs he knew could get more than the odd fence bunny across, mostly straight-laced white girls out of the Dakotas who took fucking forever to break in, and even then didn't play too well to popular demand. Mama was still coughing. Still wouldn't take her fucking pills. Now Valdez was lining up in the wake of another too hard, too fast fuck-up, 2 spots floating nice and loose over open pockets, clean back-up angles everywhere, and then the 8-ball doubled into the side, one of Valdez's favourite cheap trick shots. He'd do it with his fucking eyes closed if he wanted. Another $50. But Valdez frowned instead and lifted his chin off the cue. Got up and came around the table to Dougie, eyes narrowed. "Hey, Pengo mio, you say Elvira wasn't working tonight?" He nodded across the gloom to the bar. "Because if that ain't work, then you got a problem." So Dougie slanted a glance across the gloom to where Valdez was looking, and like the rest of it wasn't fucking enough, here's Elvie on her stool with her back to the bar, elbows down and tits cranked out in that red top he bought her back in May, legs making all kinds of slit-skirt angles on the frame of the stool, and all for this big black guy, draped over the next stool and just looking her over like she's fruit on some Mead Avenue street stall. Too fucking much. He hefted the cue up one-handed through his own grip, 1/2 meter down from the tip where it thickened, reversed his grip and carried it low at his side across the bar. Elvira saw him coming, made that dumb fucking face of hers and stopped gabbing. Dougie let the silence work for him. Came on a couple more steps and locked to a halt 1.5 meters off the black guy's shoulder.
"That's a mistake you're making, pal,"
he said, breathing hard. Anger slurred through his tone like smeared paint on a cheap logo.
"See, Elvira here isn't working tonight. You want some cheap fucking pussy? You better come around and see her another fucking day. Got that?"
"We're just talking." The black guy's tone was low and reasonable, almost bored. Weird fucking accent as well. He didn't even look at Dougie.
"If Elvira's not working, I guess she's free to do that, right?"
Dougie felt the weight of the day come down on him like demolition.
"I don't think you're paying attention,"
he told the guy tightly. And then the black guy did look at him. A sudden switch, so his eyes collected Dougie's stare like third base snapping up a low ball out at Monster Park. "No, I am," he said. It stopped Dougie dead in his tracks, knocked him back and kept the cue at his side, because at some level he couldn't quite nail, he knew this guy was actively looking for what came next. It felt like a skid, like ice under his wheels when he least expected it. He knew he had to keep going. No one much in the place tonight, but Valdez was watching, so were the barkeep and a couple of others. Whatever went down, Street Feed would have it out to everyone by morning. He had to fuck this guy up. But the ground under his feet had shifted, was no longer safe. He couldn't fucking read this guy, or what he'd do. He tightened his grip on the cue.
"Try to hit me with that thing," said the black man softly. "I will kill you."
Dougie's heart kicked in his chest. He felt the rage flicker, overstoked, held too long, suddenly unreliable. Tiny, rain-drip voice of caution in the gap. He drew breath, forced the knowledge down.
"Door's over there," he said. "Just walk the fuck away."
"My feet are tired." So Dougie just swung that fucking cue like he'd always known deep down he'd have to. Lips peeled back off a snarl and the shaky lift of the held-too-long adrenal surge. Situation like that? What else was he going to fucking do? Even as the fight bloomed, Carl could feel the small seep of disappointment at the back of it all. This swaggering, low-grade gangster in front of him, a little more spine than most pimps, maybe, but in the end no competition, no real threat.
"Yeah, like you expected anything else out here. Black-walled bunker bar in a derelict neighborhood on the edge of an all-but-fully automated Navy yard."
Not like he hadn't discussed it carefully enough with the autocab, walked the deserted streets for long enough looking.
"Face it, Soak, this is exactly what you've been prowling for. This is what you wanted. Enjoy."
The fight was so mapped out in his head it was almost preordained. He already had his weight braced off the stool he'd been using, some in the forearm where he leaned on the bar, more in his legs than he showed. He saw the intention tremor down the other guy's arm, grabbed a leg of the stool and yanked the whole thing savagely upward. The leg ends hit and gouged, face and chest. Swing momentum on the seat end hooked the thing around and blocked out the cue completely. The strike never made it above waist height. He let go, stepped in as the pimp reeled back, hand up to the rip in his face. The stool tumbled away. Carl threw a long chop, hard as he could make it, into the unguarded side of the throat. The pimp hit the floor. Dead, as far as he could tell. Elvira shrieked. At the pool table, the pimp's shaven-headed friend stood shocked and motionless, cue held defensively across his body in both hands. Carl stalked forward a couple of steps, proximity sense peeled for the rest of the room.
"Well?"
he rasped. It was 6 meters at most. If the skinhead had a gun, he wasn't going to have time to clear it before Carl was on him. Carl saw in his face that he knew it. Peripheral vision left. The barkeep fumbling for something, phone or weapon. Carl threw out an arm, finger raised. "Don't!" On the floor, the pimp moaned and shifted. Carl checked every face in the room, calibrated probable responses, then kicked the downed man in the head. The moaning stopped. "What's his name?" he asked of the room. It's Dougie," the barkeep. "Dougie Quang." "Right. Well, anyone here who's a big friend of Dougie Quang's maybe wants to stay and discuss this with me, you can. Anyone else had better leave." Hasty shuffle of feet, graunch of chair legs jammed back in a hurry, the thin crowd scrabbling to leave. The door swung open for them. He felt the cold it let in touch the back of his neck. The barkeep snatched the opportunity, went too. Left him with Elvira, who'd started grubbing about on the floor next to Dougie in tears, and the skinhead, whom Carl guessed just didn't trust getting safe passage to the door. He gave him a cold smile. "You really want to make something of this?"
"No, he doesn't. Look at his face. Stop being an asshole and let him go."
Control and the mesh stopped him whipping around at the voice, the cool amusement and the iron certainty beneath. He already knew from the tone that there was a gun pointing at him. That he wasn't on the floor next to Dougie, shot dead or dying, was the only part that didn't make sense. He shelved the wonder, stepped aside with ironic courtesy, and gestured the skinhead to pass him. Momentary flashback to the chapel in South Florida State, the sneering white supremacist walking past him up the aisle. Suddenly he was sick of it all. The cheap postures and moves, the use of stairs, the whole fucking mechanistic predictability of the man dance. "Go on," he said flatly. "Looks like you get a free pass. Better take Elvira there with you." He watched Dougie Quang's friend drop the pool cue he was clutching and come forward a hesitant step at a time. He couldn't work out what was going on either. His eyes flickered from Carl to whoever the new arrival was and back. A numb failure to catch up was stamped across his face like a boot print. He knelt beside the off-duty whore and tried to manhandle her to her feet. She wriggled and wept, refused to get up, hands still plastered on Dougie's motionless form, long dark curling hair shrouding his eyes-wide frozen face. She keened and sobbed, half-comprehensible fragments, some Sino-Spanish street mix Carl couldn't follow well. "Enjoying our handiwork here, are we?" He wondered momentarily if, when the time came, there'd be a woman, any woman, to weep like this for him. "We don't have all night," said the voice behind him. Carl turned slowly, fear of the bullet prickling at the base of his neck. Time to see what the fuck had gone wrong. Right, like you don't already know. There was a tall man at the door. A couple of others, too. Neither of them small, but it was this one who drew attention the way you vectored in on colour in a drab landscape. Carl's mesh-sharpened senses fixed on the heavy silver revolver in the raised and black-gloved hand, the bizarre, consciously antiquated statement it made, but it wasn't that. Wasn't the oily, slicked-back dark hair, or the slight sheen on the tanned and creased white features, telltale marks of cell-fix facial and hair gel for an assassin who had no intention of leaving genetic trace material at the scene of his crime. Carl saw all this and set it aside for what really mattered. It was the way the man stood, the way he looked into the room as if it were a stage set purely for his benefit. It was the way his dark clothes were wrapped on his body as if blown there by a storm, as if he didn't much care whether he wore them or not. The way his tanned face had some vague familiarity to it, some sense that you must have met this person before somewhere and that he had meant something to you back then. 13. Had to be. Paranoia confirmed. Merrin's back office crew, come for payback. It wasn't over. Beside Carl, the pool player spoke urgently to Elvira, finally succeeded in getting her to her feet, and shepherded her past Carl with an arm around her shaking shoulders. The same dazed mix of shock and incomprehension on his face as before. Carl nodded him past, then turned slowly to watch him half carry Elvira to the door. The new arrivals stood aside to let the couple out, and one of them closed the door firmly afterward. All the time the silver gun never shifted from its focus. Carl gave its owner a sardonic smile and moved a few casual steps forward. The other man watched him come closer, but he didn't move or make an objection. Carl breathed. He wasn't going to get shot just yet, it appeared. But it's coming. He took the bright flicker of fear, broke it, and folded it away. The mesh and a sustained will to do damage pulsed brighter. Push it. See how far it goes. It went almost to touching distance. The tall man let him come on that far, even gave him a gentle, encouraging smile, like an indulgent adult watching a child in his charge do something daring. Close enough that Carl's assessment of the situation began to flake apart, to leave him abruptly uncertain of how to play this. But then, a couple of meters off the muzzle of the revolver, the tall man's smile shifted on his face. Never quite left it, settled into something hard and careful. "That'll do," he said softly. "I'm not that careless." Carl nodded. "You don't look it. Do I know you from somewhere?" "I don't know. Do you?" "What's your name?" "You can call me Onbekend." "Marsalis." "Yes, I know." The tall man nodded toward a nearby table. "Sit down. We've got a little time." So, cool gust of confirmation down the back of his neck, down the muscles of his forearms. "You sit down. I'm fine right here." The revolver's hammer clicked back. "Sit down, or I'll kill you." Carl looked in the eyes and saw no space there, not even for the snappy one-liner. "Looks like you're going to do that anyway." This man would put him down right here and now. He shrugged and stepped across to the table, lowered himself into one of the abandoned chairs. It was still warm from its previous occupant. He leaned back and set his feet apart as far off the table edge as he thought he could get away with. Onbekend glanced at one of his shadows, nodded at the door. The man slipped quietly outside. The remaining backup stood immobile, fixed Carl with a cold stare, and folded his arms. Onbekend checked him with another glance and then moved across and seated himself opposite Carl at the table. "You're the lottery guy, aren't you?" he said. Carl sighed. It wasn't entirely faked. "Yeah, that's me." "The one who woke up halfway home?" "Yeah. You looking for an autograph?" He got a thin smile. "I'm curious. What was it like, being stuck out there all that time, waiting?" "It was a riot. You should try it sometime." Onbekend didn't react any more than a stone. The sense of familiarity grew. Carl was certain it was specific. He knew this face, or one very like it from somewhere. "Did you feel abandoned? Like when you were 14 all over again?" 14. Carl grinned. The tiny piece of advantage felt adrenal in his veins. He cocked his head, elaborately casual. "So you were a lawman, huh? Fortress America's final set of southern fried chickens coming home to roost." Just there, just as tiny, but there nonetheless, there in the corners of Onbekend's eyes. Loss of poise, siphoned sip of anger. For just that moment, Carl had him backed up. "You think you know me? You don't fucking know me, my friend." "I'm not your fucking friend either," Carl told him mildly. "So there you go. We all make these mistakes. What do you want from me exactly?" For a moment so brief it was gone before he even registered it, Carl thought he was dead. The barrel of the revolver didn't shift, but it seemed to glimmer with intent in the lower field of his vision. Onbekend's mouth smeared a little tighter. His eyes hated a little more. "You could start by telling me how it feels to hunt down other Variant 13s for the cudlips at the UN." "Remunerative." Carl stared blandly back into the other 13's narrowed eyes. One of them was going to die in this bar. "It feels remunerative. What are you doing for a living these days?" "Surviving." "Oh, He nodded, mock understanding. "Playing the outlaw, are we?" "I'm not working for the Cudlips, if that's what you mean." "Sure you are." Carl yawned. Sudden, tension-driven demand for oxygen, out of nowhere, but it played so fucking well he could have crowed. "We're all working for the Cudlips, one way or another." Onbekend set his jaw, tipped his head a little, like a wolf or a dog listening for something faint. "You talk very easily about other men's compromises. Like I said, you don't fucking know me at all. I know you bought food today. I know you travelled here in some kind of manufactured vehicle, on city streets, built and paid for in some shape or form by the local citizenry. I know you're holding a gun you didn't build from the raw metal up in your spare time. This?" Onbekend raised the gun slightly, took the muzzle fractionally out of line. He seemed amused. Carl forced himself not to tense, not to watch the wavering weapon. "I took this gun from a man I killed." "Oh, well, there's a sustainable model of exchange. Did you kill the guy who served you breakfast this morning as well, so you wouldn't have to pay for that either? Going to murder the guy who sold or rented you your transport option, and the guy who runs the place you sleep tonight? Got plans for the people who employ them too, the ones who run the means of production, the managers and the owners, and the people who sell for them and the people who buy from them?" Carl leaned forward, grinning hard against the cool proximity of death. It felt like biting down. "Don't you fucking get it? They're all around us, the Cudlips. You can't escape them. You can't cut loose of them. Every time you consume, you're working for them. Every time you travel. On Mars, every time you fucking breathe, you're part of it." "Well," Onbekend put together another small smile of his own, "you've learned your lesson well. But I guess if you whip a dog often enough, it always will." "Oh, please. You know what? You want to pretend there's some other way? You want to escape into some mythical pre-virilicide golden age? Go live in Jesus land, where they still believe in that shit. I was there last week. They love guys like us. They'd burn us both at the stake as soon as look at us. Don't you understand? There is no place for what we are anymore." Sutherland's words seemed to rise in him. Sutherland's quiet, amused, bass timbre voice, like thunder, like strength. "They killed us 20,000 years ago with their crops and their craven connivance at hierarchy. They won, Onbekend. And you want to know why? They won because it worked. Group cooperation and bowing down to some thug with a beard worked better than standing alone as a 13 was ever going to. They ran us ragged, Onbekend, with their mobs and leaders and their fucking strength in numbers. They hunted us down, they exterminated us, and they got the future as a prize. And now here we are standing in the roof garden of the Cudlip success story, and you're telling me no. No, you didn't take the elevator or the stairs. You just fucking flew up here all on your own, all with your own 2 fucking wings. You are full of shit." Onbekend leaned forward, mirroring, eyes flaring. It was instinctive, anger-driven. The revolver shifted fractionally in his hand to allow the shift in posture, angled minutely to one side. Carl saw and held down the surge of the mesh. Not yet. Not yet. He met the other man's eyes, saw his own death there, and didn't much care. There was a rage rising in him he barely understood. The words kept him alive, warmed him as long as he could spit them out. They built us, Onbekend. They fucking built us. They brought us back from the fucking dead for the one thing we're good at, violence, slaughter. You, me, he gestured, slashing, open-handed disgust. All of us, every fucking one. We're dinosaurs. Monsters summoned up from the deep, dark, violent past to safeguard the bright lights and shopping privileges of Western civilization. And we did it for them, just like they wanted. You want to talk about Cudlips, how they bow and fold to authority, how they let the group dictate? Tell me how we were different. Project fucking Lawman? What does that sound like to you? Yeah,
Because they fucking trained us.
For the first time, Ombeken's voice rose almost to a shout, was almost pain. He flattened it again, instantly, got it down to a cold, even-tempered anger.
They locked us up from childhood, Marsalis. Beat us down with the conditioning. You know that. Osprey must have been the same. How were we supposed to...
We did as we were told. Carl spaced his words, leaned on them like crowbars going into brickwork. Just like them. Just like the Cudlips. We failed. Just like we failed 20,000 years ago.
That was then, Onbeken snapped. And this is now. And some of us aren't on that path anymore.
Oh, don't make me fucking laugh. I already told you, everything about you is part of the Cudlip world. If you can't come to some kind of accommodation with that, you might as well fucking shoot yourself. A ghost grin came up across Ombeken's face.
It was your suicide I was sent to arrange, Marsalis. Not mine.
Sent? Carl jeered it, leered across the scant space between them. Sent? Oh, I rest my fucking case.
13s have had an unfortunate propensity for death by their own hand.
The other man's voice came out, raised. Words rushed, trampling at Carl's scorn, trying to drive home a winning point he hadn't embedded quite as well as he'd hoped.
Violent suicide, in the tracts and reservations, and a 13 carrying as much guilt as you.
Guilt? Give me a fucking break. Now you're talking just like them. Variant 13 doesn't do guilt. That's a Cudlip thing.
Yes, all the ones you've hunted down, murdered, or taken back to a living death in the tracts.
But Omvekend was calmer now, voice dropping back to even.
It stands to reason you couldn't live with it forever.
Try me. A bleak smile.
Happily, I don't have to. And as for the suicide, you've made it easy for me.
Really? Carl looked elaborately around him. This doesn't look much like a suicide scene to me. But under the drawl he already saw the angle, and something very like panic started to ice through him. He'd played all his cards, and Onbekend just hadn't loosened enough. The other 13 was watching him minutely again, back to the cold control he'd walked in with. Awareness of the place they were in congealed around him, ancient grimy fittings, the long arm of the bar top, scars and spill stains gleaming in the low light on the piled-up glassware and bottles behind. The worn pool tables in their puddles of light from the overheads, Dougie Quang, face up on the floor, head rolled to one side, eyes staring open across the room at him. Waiting for company. For someone to join him down there in the dust and sticky stains.
Suicide would be hard to fake here, Ombekennd agreed. Would have been harder to fake wherever we did it. But you've been kind enough to let your drives get the better of you, and so here we are. A mindless bar brawl in a low-grade neighborhood, with low-grade criminals to match, and it seems Carl Marsalis just miscalled the odds. Pretty fucking stupid way to die, but hey.
A shrug. Ombekend's voice tinged suddenly with contempt.
They'll believe it of you. You've given them no reason not to.
The oblique accusation stung. In the back of his head, Sutherland concurred.
If we are ruled by our limbic wiring, then every bigoted, hate-driven fear they have of us becomes a truth. Ertekin might not buy it. Yeah, but she might. You don't always get a clean rap, Marsalis, remember that? Life is messy, and so is crime.
Quang seemed to wink at him from the floor.
Could be this'll be just messy enough for her, Soak.
As if he didn't have enough with his own thoughts beating him up, Ombekend was still going strong.
They'll believe you were too stupid to beat your own programming, he said matter-of-factly, as if he'd been there for Sutherland's musings too. Because you are. They'll believe you went looking for trouble, because you did exactly that, and they'll believe you found a little too much of it down here to handle alone. So they'll do a little light investigating. They'll talk to some people, and in the end they'll decide you got shot at close range with a nondescript gun that'll never be found, in the hand of some nameless street thug who'll also never be found. And they'll walk away, Marsalis. They'll walk away because it fit right in with this idiocy you've spontaneously generated for us. I couldn't have arranged it better myself."
Carl gestured. "That's hardly a nondescript gun."
"This?"
Ombekend lifted the revolver again, weighed it in his hand.
"This is—"
Now. It wasn't much. The fractionally lowered reflexive response in the other man, neurochemical sparks lulled and damped down by Carl's previous open-handed gestures and the descending calm after all the shouting. Then the fractional shift of the revolver's muzzle, the few degrees off and the brief lack of tension on the trigger. Then Ombekend's standard-issue 13 sense of superiority, the curious need he seemed to have to lecture. It wasn't much. Not much at all. Carl exploded out of the chair, hands to the table edge, flipping it up and over. Ombekend got one shot off wide, and then he was staggering back, trying to get out of the chair and on his feet. The shadow by the door yelled and moved. Carl was across the empty space where the table had been, into Ombekend, palm heel and hooking elbow, turning, try for the gun, lock in close, too close to shoot at. He had the other 13's arm in both hands now, twisting the revolver up and around, looking for the man by the door, tried for the trigger. Ombekend got his finger out, blocked the attempt, but it didn't matter. The other man yelled again, dodged away from the slug he thought was coming. The door flew inward on its hinges. The other half of Ombekend's human backup burst into the room. Carl yanked at the revolver, couldn't get it free. The new arrival didn't make the same mistake as his companion. He stepped in, grinning.
"Just hold him there, Onby."
Desperate, Carl hacked sideways with one foot, tried to get the fight on the ground and jar the revolver out of Ombekend's stubborn grip. The other 13 locked ankles with him, stood firm, and Carl tumbled instead, pulled off balance by his own weight and a Tanindo move that hadn't worked. Ombekend timed it just right, stepped wide, and shrugged him off like a heavy backpack. He went down clutching for the revolver, didn't get it. Ombekend kicked him in the groin. He convulsed around the blow, tried frantically to roll, to get up. Ombekend levelled the revolver. The world seemed to stop, to lean in and watch. In the small, unreal stillness he knew the impact before it came, and the knowledge was terrifying because it felt like freedom. He felt himself open to it, like spreading wings, like snarling, his eyes locked with Ombekend's. He grinned and spat out a final defiance. "You sad, deluded little fuck." And then the gun blasts, the final violence through the quiet. Again, again, again. Like the repeated slamming of a door in a storm.
This is the end of the CD. The program continues on the next CD.